When you're mixing music, one super important tool that you're going to be using is equalization. You use an equalizer to perform equalization, and what we're really doing is we're affecting frequency, right? So let's take a look and dive a little bit deeper into some methods in which we might use equalization to help us out in sort of a basic foundation of music mixing. Equalization is the process of adjusting frequency content. So you can think of it as frequency-specific volume control. What does that really mean? If you can think of the frequency spectrum, remember we're dealing with 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz as our spectrum of audio frequencies that the human ear can actually hear, right? So starting at 20 hertz being the lowest bass sounds to 20 kilohertz being the highest highs, we have all that space in between, and lots of recordings, lots of audio content is going to contain elements of that whole frequency spectrum, right? And what we're going to be able to do is have individualized control over certain frequency areas known as bands, so like groups of frequencies that we can adjust by boosting or cutting those specific areas to start to shape or sculpt all of our different sounds. Now, sometimes we perform equalization on a finished product, right? Like the stereo recording that was the finished product. We might adjust frequency or something, but and you can think of that as like when you're in your car and you're adjusting the bass, middle, and treble. That's an equalizer with 3 frequency bands. And what you're doing is taking anything that's coming through that stereo and saying, hey, I want to enhance, I want to boost up the bass by cranking up the bass. Or I want to tame the mids and lower those a little bit, right? So you're effectively using an equalizer in that instance, but it's affecting the overall sound that you're hearing out of the speakers. What we do in the mixing process, since we have access to the stems or the individual elements of a piece of music, we're going to apply equalization to each one of those individual elements along with a master fader or say the final finished product. So what are the reasons that we're going to use equalization? Well, I can think of a few different ones. Number one, the first thing that I'm going to do is listen to each individual sound and decide if I need to use equalization to clean up or fix problematic audio, right? Maybe a vocalist is very sibilant, right? The exaggeration of the S consonant. Or maybe there's an acoustic guitar recording and there's lots of like hand sliding and pick noise. I might use EQ to tame some of those particular frequency areas to clean up the sound a little bit. Maybe there's some low frequency rumble that we can just eliminate by removing all low frequency sound. Right, so we're going to address the very first thing that I would do with EQ is use it to sort of clean up a sound. But step number 2, we might polish something up and enhance it, right? We might take, after we clean something up, or maybe it was a really pristine recording to begin with, but we want to really make sure that the vocals shine through. So we're going to boost and shelf the high frequency sound so we get this nice airiness and special quality to the sound. We want to exaggerate the good areas. So we can use EQ so far to 1, remove the problem areas, and then 2, enhance the nice areas, right? So then we're sort of shaping and sculpting a sound and exaggerating or emphasizing the good stuff and removing the bad stuff. Another reason why I might use it is to get really creative. Maybe we want to use EQ to make a vocal sound like it's coming through a telephone. Or maybe we want something to sound like it's underwater or to change over time, right? We can use equalization to do some of those types of things and really get outside of the box and make something truly unique. Think creatively is also how mixing engineers kind of put a creative stamp on something. You might learn or develop a particular equalization technique that you really make your own, and that becomes sort of like your signature contribution to a project. All right, it's important to understand that there are a couple of different types of equalizers. So the equalizer is the tool that we use to process frequency. And there are 2 main types of equalizers. They are graphic equalizers and parametric equalizers. A graphic EQ will break down the frequency spectrum into different smaller groups of frequencies known as bands. Okay, and what it allows you to do is it'll essentially give you like a slider or a fader for each frequency band, so you can decide whether you want to raise or lower the amount of those frequencies that you hear. The problem is you can't, those frequency bands on a graphic equalizer are predetermined. You can't decide that maybe halfway in between that frequency band you want to make a different adjustment. No, they're hardwired the way that they are. So you've got access to the 1 kilohertz range, then you want to raise or lower the slider. It's dialed in specifically to that frequency range. Can't adjust it. Whereas a parametric equalizer, which has curves, as you can see, and it's kind of what we're more used to seeing. A graphic equalizer is something you might see on an old, fancy stereo or something like that, but they still exist. The parametric equalizer just gives us a more flexibility. We can change the frequency bands that we're manipulating, and we do that by adjusting curves, right? We can make them the band width or the width of those curves more narrow or more sloped so that we can adjust and be more surgical about the frequency content that we're making adjustments to. So graphic and parametric equalizers, both of those exist. Parametric equalizers give us just a little bit more of an advantage or flexibility in how we use them. So what are the different methods that we apply equalization to frequency content? Well, there's additive and subtractive methods. Additive meaning I'm adding frequency content, or I'm adding at least the intensity of specific frequency content because I like that sound or want to exaggerate it, right? Subtractive EQ, which is the one that I recommend approaching first, is by taking away the frequencies that you don't like so much. And the reason why I say I recommend going with subtractive equalization first is because there's just sort of a mentality, or maybe it's just sort of the natural human way, is to say like, well, I need to hear this a little bit more. I'm going to boost it up. I need to hear this a little bit more. Let's crank it up. And then before you know it, you're muddying your mix, you're stacking sounds on top of each other. You're introducing all this frequency content, and it's just too much to make sense out of. So a lot of times I'm practicing subtractive EQ to remove some of the bad stuff, and I'm making small additive boosts to just sort of exaggerate or accentuate the really good parts of a sound. Now we come to the different filter techniques that you might hear about in regards to equalization. Easiest and honestly, in my opinion, some of the most useful is a high and a low pass filter. What this does is it allows us to choose a frequency on both the low and the high end of a sound, at which point we want to cut out all frequency on either side of those things. And a lot of times people they tend to mix up the difference between high and low pass filters. Think of it like this. A high pass filter is going to allow high frequencies to pass through it, and we're going to hear as a result, but it's going to block out all the low frequency sound. So a high pass filter allows high frequency sound to be heard and blocks low frequency sound. A low pass filter is going to do the opposite. It's going to allow the low frequency sound and block out all the high frequency stuff based on a frequency range that you determine, right? So a lot of times what I'll do when I'm approaching an individual sound is I'll turn on my low and high pass filters and sculpt out the sound by notching away at the different, at the high and the low end, until I notice that the sound itself is being compromised, right? I don't need low frequency content for a lot of my instruments, or a lot of my sounds, so I will use a high pass filter and cut out low frequency sound until I notice that the actual sound that I want is being affected in a negative way. So I can apply those things relatively easy. Now, what happens when you use a high pass filter too much? Well, what happens is you wind up with only the high frequency content, right? It cuts out all the low end, and what you wind up with is almost like the effect that somebody's on the telephone. You don't hear that low bass rumble. And vice versa, if I overuse a low pass filter, I'm cutting out all the high frequency sound, and everything sounds like a blanket's been thrown on top of it, or that it's underwater or something. But it's important to understand how those high and low pass filters will affect your sound, because maybe you want to achieve those results, and understanding how they work and what their results are is going to help you achieve your goals a little bit faster. A shelf filter takes a certain frequency point and decides, well, starting at this point, I'm going to just raise everything from here on after, or from here on before, right? So it's giving us an opportunity to like use a whole like range of frequency content that we're just going to boost up, but in this shelving sort of manner. So these images I think are really helpful. The comb filter is a result of, let's say, lots of different, very surgical, subtractive EQ moves. So it looks like an upside down comb because we're digging out these narrow, thin pieces of EQ or frequency content, but in a very substantial sort of way. So we're removing effectively all these nasty, bad sounds, but being very specific about which sections we're removing. And that's sort of an overview of equalization. Hopefully those tools are going to come in useful for you as you approach your first few music mixes. EQ is an essential tool that is going to take a while to master, but it just comes with practice, so keep at it.